That sounds like a robot. Well, look, to repeat it, I'm delighted to see you all. It's a pity we can't actually meet up in reality. Um, However, you know, things could be worse. There isn't a famine on. There's a pandemic, but no famine. Just think of Mary Ann McCracken in 1849 going out round the streets of Belfast collecting for famine relief while there was a pandemic underway, cholera. So, you know, in the past, things were worse. Anyway, uh, back to Mary Ann McCracken. I think that we would all agree that Mary Ann has a reasonable claim to be considered Belfast's most formidable female radical of her era. As feminist before the term was invented, as revolutionary, and as reformer. Um, I have sought to offer a new and penetrating analysis of her life. What on earth can I add to Mary McNeill's pioneering biography, which has rightly been republished by Irish Academic Press this year? In fact, there have been, I think I'm right in saying, over the years, no less than 4 editions of that excellent work. That was a question, you know, could I add anything to it? That was a question I asked myself as far back as 1998, when I was asked at relatively short notice to give a lecture on her at the Burn Perry Summer School in Wexford. Surely all the information I needed and more was in Mary McNeill's biography. And yet that seemed a bit of a cop-out. And I also had an indefinable feeling that McNeill's account didn't ring entirely true. What could I do? Nothing for it but to go to the original sources that McNeill herself had used. That is Mary Ann and Henry Joy's correspondence in the Madden papers in Trinity College in Dublin. I always recommend seeing the originals. They exude passions that can get lost in cold print. Certainly the find of a lock of Henry Joy's hair added a frisson that could not be found in any book. But could I find any evidence that would significantly change our assessment of Mary Ann? I did. Mary McNeill and myself are at one with regard to Mary Ann's devotion to her brother, Henry Joy, though I do suggest that she took quite a leading role in the relationship. After all, in 1797, she wrote to him, he was in prison at the time, urging that Ireland's best patriots should not sink from their duty, but must meet their fate equally unappalled, whether it be on the scaffold or in the field, thus foreshadowing his death a year later. It was in this period, and as a reader of Mary Wollstonecraft, that she urged upon her brother the rights of women in the United Irish organization and elsewhere. If her obligation was to her brother alone, that surely ended with his execution in 1798. Yet Mary Ann remained actively involved in events up to the failed rising in 1803. And along with her sister Margaret and her brother John, made every effort to save Thomas Russell. Mary McNeill suggests that Mary Ann's involvement in this period merely arose from her devotion to Thomas Russell, and that she may have wished to marry him. The crucial letter which entirely torpedoes this theory, was one that Mary Ann wrote to her Dublin-based cousin, Grizzy, in 1799. What a wonderful clamour is now raised at the name of union, when in reality there has always been such an union between England and this country, as there is between husband and wife, by which the former has the right to oppress the other. From this, we may conclude that Mary Ann opposed the act of union and had no desire to marry anyone. Indeed, like her sisters, she was to remain unmarried. Her relationship with Russell was that of a comrade. Read it this way, and we remove the adoration of male heroes as Mary Ann's motivating force. And she emerges as a determined revolutionary in her own right. How did she and the other members of the McCracken family come to be so centrally engaged in the United Irish enterprise? The story of the exclusion of the overwhelmingly Presbyterian citizenry of small-town Belfast from political power and their resentment of the corrupt and largely useless corporation is well known. Less well analysed is their creation of an alternative civic republic based on the 3 Presbyterian meeting houses in Rosemary Lane, on the Charitable Society and Poor House, in the Belfast Library and Society for Promoting Knowledge, the future Linen Hall Library, and in the revived volunteer movement which sought to emulate the French National Guard. One aspect of this deserves further examination. Like nearly all the United Irishmen and women, Mary Ann was deeply religious, though hers was a religion that did decree love thy neighbour. Her father, Captain McCracken, came from the Scottish Covenanting tradition, many of whom were driven forth to Ulster in the 1690s. They had known persecution. They were members of the theologically conservative Third Presbyterian Church, and this rather than the New Light First Presbyterian Church, which survives to this day, where the Reverend William Bruce, a bitter opponent of the United Irishmen, held sway. Sorry, page turning. By contrast, the McCracken's minister, the Rev Sinclair Kelburn, a close family friend, was to the fore in every radical meeting of the period, chairing some of them, and epitomized Covenanter distrust of unjust government. In 1792, he declared he had heard of a government by kings, lords, and commons, but could never approve of hereditary legislators because wisdom is not hereditary. As far as the government was concerned, he was a Jacobin, and he was imprisoned alongside Henry Joy for his pains. Following the defeat of the United Irishmen, Mary Ann had, like everybody else, to come to terms with the new order, but in her case, only up to a point. In the course of assisting Edward Bunting in his pioneering work, collecting and publishing the ancient Irish music, she made the acquaintance of another almost forgotten woman, Mary Balfour, who ran a school for girls, was Belfast's first published poetess, and who continued to revere the United Irish martyrs in verse. Her poems celebrating Henry Joy was so incendiary that it was only published in 1896. Mary Ann and her sister had been unusual in running their own muslin business, but it fell foul of the recession at the end of the Napoleonic Wars. Unlike other employers, they had continued to pay their weavers, but it was an unsustainable position in ungenerous times. One of the few openings for unmarried women in the 19th century was to engage in charitable work. Best known is Mary Ann's role in the Belfast Charitable Society as secretary of the Women's Committee, about which Aaron is going to speak later. There, and in summary, There she pushed the boundaries of what it was possible for a women's committee to do in a male-dominated organization, and pushed it as far as it was possible to do. She was engaged in multiple other causes, which I think heretofore we've rather lost sight of. These were primarily with women's committees. Further work needs to be done on these because the evidence for their existence is fleeting and fragmentary as far as I've been able to find it out. I have found some clues. And I mean, maybe these are organizations that were so discounted and not cared for that their records are sort of lost to posterity. But what I have identified is that they were determinedly non-sectarian in their approach to major issues such as education for poor children, or in the cause of famine relief. And this in a world where philanthropy became increasingly sectarianized by mid-century. There were too many, very many indeed, who were prepared to educate poor children, but wished to save their souls first, or saw famine relief primarily as a means to conversion, hence the birth of superism. Not from Mary Ann McCracken, any such approach. She also recognized the limitations of philanthropy and advocated the introduction of income tax as a fair basis for providing for the poor, though she saw no hope of its introduction in her time. The rich would see to that. Mary Ann recognized the shift in opinion in favor of the union with Britain, but remained a doubter as to its benefits. Mary McNeill is right that there is no evidence that she backed Daniel O'Connell's campaign for the repeal of the union. But perhaps what she omits is that Mary Ann was a great admirer of Daniel O'Connell. For her, he deserved the lasting gratitude of all true philanthropists, and even more, had the capacity to ensure that Ireland would be the finest nation in the world. And if you thought Ireland was going to be the finest nation in the world, that surely implied an end to the Act of Union. In the 1850s, and now in great old age, she complained about government complicity in the revival of the Orange Order, about landlord oppression, and about brutal British conduct in India. That other cause with which she is most closely associated was the abolition of slavery. She saw parallels between Black slavery and the slavery of women, and perhaps that is one explanation of why so many women were involved in the anti-slavery campaign and the anti-slavery movement. She was active at the time of Frederick Douglass's visit in the 1840s. And by way of a brief deviation, can I say how delighted I am by the news that, and I'm sure we all are, that the City Council is going to erect a statue of Frederick Douglass in Rosemary Street. And what's more, that it was a unanimous decision to do so. That's a major breakthrough. Well, she was there on the committee, or another women's committee that was formed at the time of Frederick Douglass's visit, but she was still there handing out leaflets on the Belfast quays in the 1860s, by which time she was bemoaning the falling away of the town's support for the cause in favor of filthy lucre. You know, while endlessly praising our town, our city, for its utter opposition to slavery, and we forget that by the 1860s, a significant proportion of Belfast's population, and Presbyterians included, and its newspapers backed the southern states in the Civil War. You know, that's the bit of Belfast's anti-slavery history that civic pride would rather have us forget, and it deserves further exploration. Mary Ann never forgot the sacrifice of her brother, but she was determined that the historical record of the United Irish enterprise as a whole should be set straight. She was a vital informant to Richard Madden in writing his Lives of the United Irishmen during the 1840s, and gave him all her surviving papers, hence that wonderful archive in Trinity College. In doing so, she offered Madden guidance that has stood the test of time. She wished that truth and falsehood might be separated while there were competent witnesses to do so. I do not think it would be consistent with truth, the legitimate object of history, to suppress any well-authenticated fact. Let the blame rest where it may, the run of history being to promote the knowledge of mankind and the service of governing. Well, here I say, that is certainly advice which could well be applied with equal validity to ourselves in dealing with the legacy of our own troubles. It may seem obvious to us today that Mary Ann was on the right side of history, and thus she can be very easily co-opted by all sides as a model female pioneer. What we forget is how far ahead of her times she was, and how she had to struggle, always struggle against the odds. Her story should accordingly lend strength to new generations willing to fight for a better society, however daunting the task. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much there, John. That was very good. We talked you did there. Can everybody see me there?
Yep.
See me, yeah. This is the wee pamphlet here John was talking about, okay? It's 40 pages and it's really good edition to have for just for Irish history as a whole, you know, to understand what was going on in Belfast up here and why Mrs. McCracken was so is still remembered today, really. And now I'm going to pass you on to Aaron McIntyre of Clifton House. Okay, Aaron.
Oh, thank you very much, Stephen. Just share my screen here. Just check that you can hear me and see the screen okay, Stephen?
Yep, that's okay.
Well, it's a great privilege to be able to speak tonight about Mary Ann McCracken's involvement with the Belfast Charitable Society as a particular example of her philanthropic work. Before I get into her involvement with the charity, I just want to provide a wee bit of background for those who've maybe never heard of Clifton House or the Charitable Society. And the Belfast Charitable Society started out where all good ideas happen, in a pub in Belfast on a Friday night. And these were a group of leading Presbyterians and the local Church of Ann Vicar who came together in order to help tackle the poverty and destitution that was rife in Belfast at that point. And as many of you'll know, the Presbyterians suffered under the penal laws, and it limited a number of their rights, including standing for election and holding certain crown positions. And the Belfast Charitable Society came together and decided to set up a poorhouse in the first hospital for the town of Belfast. And this was part of what John Gray has termed the civic republic that the Presbyterians helped to establish in the town. And the Belfast Charitable Society decided that the best way to raise money for this particular enterprise was through a lottery scheme. I don't know if any of you are Presbyterians or maybe know of the Presbyterian faith today, but they wouldn't touch the proceeds of gambling. But the Presbyterians, as many of you'll be aware, in the 1700s were of a slightly different ilk than those today. And I hold my hands up and say my grandmother is a Presbyterian, so hopefully I don't cause any offence. But the Belfast Charitable Society had two failed lottery schemes, and in the third attempt, they gave it to a man called Henry Joy. And Henry Joy was Mary Ann McCracken's maternal uncle, and he decided that he wasn't going to be caught out like the previous lottery managers. And he decided that if you promised to buy a ticket from him, he would send a messenger boy to your house twice a day, every day, until you paid up your debt. Quite literally raising the money for the poor house through embarrassment and harassment. And we have one of the original lottery tickets. It's in the collection of the Ulster Museum on the left-hand side. And his brother, a man called Robert Joy, another uncle of Mary Ann's, had done some sketches on the back of a linen napkin about what design he wanted for the poor house. Now, the charity had asked for proposals to come in from the likes of London, Dublin, and Liverpool, but when they saw the design that Robert Joy came up with, they agreed unanimously that that was what they wanted for their poor house. And you can see what remains Clifton House today, pictured on the left-hand side, probably the most elegant surviving example of Georgian architecture in Belfast, if not the whole of Ulster, if I can go that far. And you maybe noticed the unusual spire on top of the poor house, and the supposed reason for this was due to the penal laws. Only the religious buildings of the Church of Ireland faith could erect spires on their buildings, because these would have been the skyscrapers of their day. And Robert Joy realised that he had a loophole in the law, because this was never a religious institution that catered for people of all religions and none, and up went the spire that you see. Unfortunately, the Chichester family, who were the landed gentry who owned Belfast, were furious at this spire going up, because they had granted the charity a piece of land to build her house on. And so they were constructing the original St. Anne's Church, which if you're from Belfast, you'll maybe know today as St. Anne's Cathedral. And it's pictured on the right-hand side. And realizing that they couldn't do anything to step in and stop the Charitable Society, they added a double-height spire onto their building, and you can see how out of proportion it is with the original portico of St. Anne's Church. And I only found out recently that the upper tier of the building was actually constructed of wood that was plastered to give it that extra height. It couldn't support the weight of a bell for a number of years until they made some adjustments. So there's politics and everything, including architecture. There's really no escaping it. But going back to Mary Ann McCracken's involvement, yes, her uncles were on the board, so was her father. But from a very early age, she was involved with creating or making clothes for the children of the poor house. Her mother, it was said, was sewing with her when Mary Ann was a little more than 5 or 6 years old. And when they came up to the poor house to deliver the clothes, Mary Ann was allowed to visit the children's quarters. And this really created a soft spot in her heart for these young boys and girls. And this led to her being involved right throughout her life. One of the most recent things that we've discovered in our archive is some of the small charitable work that Mary Ann McCracken was involved in. On the left-hand side of the slide, you'll see our Fisher's Row rent book, which was a small row of cottages that were along the front of Clifton House in the 17 and 1800s. And I don't know if you can make it out there, but Miss McCracken, Mary Ann, was paying the rent for Widow Mullen over a substantial period of time from 1823 right the way through to 1827. And I think this goes back to what John says. There's so many records of her different philanthropic work that just haven't survived. And this is just one example of a reference to Mary Ann in our own papers. But before a ladies' committee was formed in the poor house to look after the women and children's side, Mary Ann was showing her presence much earlier. And in 1819, Mary Ann is recorded in our minute books as meeting with Dr. Hannah and Mr. Joy, who was her first cousin Henry Joy, pictured on the right-hand side of the slide. And she was intervening in the case of a young girl called Ellen Murray. And Mr. Joy and his colleague were asked to wait on Miss McCracken and explain to her why the committee would not admit this young girl. A week later, it's recorded in the minute books that they were going to reconsider young Ellen's case. And a few weeks after that, in the minute books, she was dismissed for being irregularly admitted by Miss McCracken. So it shows you an idea of how much influence that she had over the men before there was a ladies' committee. After Ellen was dismissed for the second time, Miss McCracken came to one of the meetings, and lo and behold, it simply records Ellen Murray to be readmitted. And by the 1820s, an idea had been planted by a lady called Elizabeth Fry, pictured on the left-hand side. And Elizabeth Fry was a Quaker. She was involved with prison reform, and she came to Ireland on a tour of Irish prisons and met with a group of women in Belfast down at the Frederick Street Meeting House. And she encouraged the women to get involved with the different charities, to set up ladies' committees, and actually have some form of say in civic society, regardless of how limited that might be. And Mary Ann jumped at the chance to help establish this ladies' committee for the poorhouse, which really was a family institution for the McCrackens as well as the Joys. And when Mary Ann McCracken set up the ladies' committee with a group of about 30 other women who signed the first minutes, they wrote to the men's committee, and I'm going to quote here from them, that the ladies beg most earnestly to assure the men that there shall be no interference whatsoever with any of their managements and regulations. End of quote. And I hope they had their fingers crossed when they wrote that to them, because they interfered in every which way that they could. Mary Ann's first big thing with the ladies' committee was to try and set up a nursery school. And this may seem quite standard to us by our modern view of education, but it was something quite forward thinking in the 1820s in Belfast. And nursery school had been set up for the middle classes and the landed gentry. And in Mary Ann's eyes, if it was good enough for the rich children, it was good enough for what she termed her children in the poorhouse. And she really did see herself as a maternal figure. And this is reflected in many of her writings, especially to some of the local newspapers, about how factory owners should see themselves as the father figures of any young children working in their establishments. And Mary Ann did what was asked of her. In the first instance, she wrote a proposal and sent it to the men's committee. And they came back saying, under no circumstances, we don't have the time, the money, or the resources to do this. And so she left it a few months, continued on with other projects in the house. And then she wrote for a second time. And again, it was a flat no. And on the third attempt, realizing that it was far easier to ask for forgiveness than ask for permission, Mary Ann wrote to the men's committee and informed them that a nursery school had been up and running for 2 weeks, and they now needed the men's committee to aid the ladies in completing what they had commenced. And lo and behold, the men gave in. They referred to her as the tenacious Miss McCracken, and she fought many running wars of attrition with the men's committee, but I would say the majority of the time managed to get her way. And these requests varied from getting sweet milk for the children instead of them drinking buttermilk, right the way through to educational equipment and swings and toys in the poorhouse grounds. She really covered all bases. And it wasn't just the nursery school that Mary Ann was interested in. Prior to the foundation of the Ladies' Committee, the men taught the children basic reading, writing, and arithmetic. But Mary Ann knew the benefits of a good education herself, and she had been taught by a man called David Manson, who had run a co-educational school in Belfast. And it was very forward thinking. He didn't believe in corporal punishment, and he believed in rewarding good behaviour through a ticketing system and small rewards for the children. And Mary Ann brought these sort of systems into the poorhouse, and she expanded the curriculum to include music, technical drawing, and art. And children would have been provided with musical instruments and tutors brought in to teach them. And the band of the poorhouse proved to be very popular. On one occasion, on an Easter Monday, they were requested to attend 3 different church services, and ultimately they refused all 3 for fear of seeming to be preferential to any one particular denomination in Belfast. And on the right-hand side of the screen, you'll see a military bands boy in his uniform. And many of the young boys were so successful in their endeavours in terms of musical instruments that they went on to the militia bands and had quite good careers. And on the left-hand side, you'll see a typical entry from our Ladies' Committee books. And we have the Ladies' Committee books from 1827 right the way through until it folded. And this is just typical of Mary Ann's entries, that she visited the girls' schoolroom and found the children neat, clean, and busily employed knitting stockings and looking healthy and happy. And one of the things that stood out for me when I started looking into Mary Ann in the poorhouse was the fact that she believed that both boys and girls should be taught the same curriculum. So she wanted the girls to be able to read and write, but equally she was adamant that the boys were able to knit and darn their own stockings, not to have to rely on the females of their household when they were older. And I mentioned previously that Mary Ann, the ladies, promised not to interfere with the men's decisions or regulations. Well, in 1835, they commissioned an independent report into conditions of the children in the poorhouse, which came up with 10 recommendations, which I've listed on the screen there. And this is from the ladies who promised no interference whatsoever. Some of the things that stood out for me was the fact that they were looking at the diet, that the children were to get more meat. Mary Ann was a great believer in what she termed the robustness of the frame, very Dickensian language. She was very adamant about exercise, and the Ladies' Committee used to bring the children down to the foreshore in order to swim during the summer. And see their sea bathing at least 3 times a week in summer. And the one that really stood out for me was number 10, warm clothing and sound footwear to be provided in winter. And I know from conversations that I had growing up with my great-grandmother that in Belfast in the 1920s, that she didn't have sound footwear and warm clothing in summer or in winter. And we're looking at Ann McCracken, the Ladies' Committee, in the context of the 1830s, 100 years before my great-grandmother was running the streets of Belfast barefoot. And Mary Ann and the ladies were also sticklers for cleanliness. They appointed an inspectress of soap in order to make sure that the children had enough soap to keep them clean. And the Ladies' Committee books are filled with references to how much soap was given out. And on one occasion, Mary Ann was furious at how little soap that they were getting to give out to the children. And she wrote a letter to the men asking the gentlemen to consult with the ladies of their own families and inquire if £2 of soap per month, that is £0.5 per week, be sufficient to wash the wearing apparel, sheets, blankets, etc. for 27 children. And the ironic thing was that the majority of the men's committee had female relatives on the ladies' committee, whether they were daughters, wives, or nieces. And she was a constant friend to the children, fighting their corner and never being satisfied with the status quo. And it wasn't just about education for Mary Ann. She really believed in giving these children a childhood. Many of them were orphaned, had no family to look after them. And as I mentioned, she really did see herself as that maternal figure. It started off with small things and grew incrementally, as was typical with Mary Ann. She started out with small wins and progressed to much bigger projects. Her first idea of giving the children a childhood was to write to the men and inform them that the children really didn't have enough knowledge about common objects outside of the walls of the institution. And so she was able to bring them out to go to the post office when she was doing her errands, and basically learn how to function outside the walls of the institution. This slowly grew, and then a request came for the erection of maypole and other wooden structures for play, which was duly granted. And then it built up to excursions to Bangor, to the Old Amos Fair, and also to the Old Belfast Museum, and that's pictured on the right-hand side. On the bottom left-hand side, you'll see the old Crystal Palace, which is on Queen's Island, which has now been taken over by shipbuilding. But the children were brought out here. They were rowed out for free by the ferrymen, who were often thanked in the minute books for doing this for the children, where they were allowed to go to the zoo and see the exhibitions that were on display there. The one area, though, that the men and ladies committees did agree on was apprenticeships. And they believed that giving a child an apprenticeship, a trade or a skill, really would help them support themselves once they'd left the poorhouse. And the Ladies Committee appointed people to go out and visit the apprentices in order to make sure that they were well looked after, that the conditions of their indenture or their contract were being met. And Mary Ann references in her letters there's so few spheres of industry open to the young girls that it really wasn't great for them. And she went as far as to make sure that the girls were placed with specific trades that would help them. And she was very much an individualist when it came to this. And one that stood out for me was a young girl who was lame. And the men's committee had decided that she would go out as a servant, as an apprentice to be a servant. And Mary Ann said that this wasn't fair on her. The young girl was lame and that she would need a more sedentary occupation, the likes of dressmaking, for example. Mary Ann also introduced a probation period where the children could go out and see if an apprenticeship was for them before signing up to their 5 or 7 year contract. And Mary Ann, who knew that these children had no other family to protect them, she made sure that the poorhouse was always open to them, whether that was in holiday times where their masters didn't want them about their own houses, or if they were sick, that the poorhouse would always be that safety net for those young children. And Mary Ann's involvement with the Ladies' Committee lasted throughout its existence. She's the only one that I can see in our minute books. It was there in 1827 and was still there in 1851 at that last meeting. And by that stage, she was 81. There was very few ladies attending. But as John's already outlined, Mary Ann didn't retire at 81. She was still standing down in Belfast docks within a few days of her 89th birthday. She still continued with a number of other philanthropic endeavours, the likes of the Lancastrian School, providing education for the poor of Belfast. She was fighting the cause of the disadvantaged right up until her final years. And very briefly, and I hope I'm not running over in time, I think I've got a few minutes left. But Mary Ann's death and burial, I just wanted to touch on this because Mary Ann is buried in Clifton Street Cemetery, which was opened by Belfast Charitable Society as a place to bury both the dead from the poorhouse, but also as a place for the merchant class to purchase pots and form of income for the Charitable Society. And Mary Ann passed away in 1866 at the age of 96. And she'd outlived her generation. And for the woman who had marked so many of the United Irishmen graves, likes of Thomas Russell's grave, she put the headstone on it, and also Jimmy Hope, but none saw fit to mark her grave when she passed away. And it was only in 1902 when bones came to the surface in an area believed to be the McCracken plot down on High Street in Belfast, that a man called Francis Joseph Bigger came down and said that these were the bones of Henry Joy McCracken, her executed brother, and he ultimately had them buried in Clifton Street Cemetery, and that's when the headstone went on to commemorate Mary Ann. And today, what is Mary Ann McCracken's relevance? Well, the Belfast Charitable Society have recently set up the Mary Ann McCracken Foundation, not just to look at Mary Ann's history, which we do want to cover. The likes of the republication of Mary McNeil's biography was one way in which we've done that, but it's also to look at her legacy and relevance today. You know, Mary Ann lived to see the end of slavery as she knew it, but we're still dealing with issues of modern day slavery and human trafficking. And we're looking to see how the Mary Ann McCracken Foundation can facilitate these difficult conversations. We've worked with the African Caribbean Support Organisation for Northern Ireland, and we had a talk funded by the Heritage Lottery Fund around the legacies of slavery and the likes of racism today in Northern Ireland, and how that had carries on from a slavery that Mary Ann would have known. And it's doing what we can to promote her story, and also to move forward and look at the issues that she would have been interested in if she were here today in the 21st century. And at this point, I'll stop sharing the screen and hand back to Stephen.
That was brilliant, Aaron. Thank you very much for that. That was great talk. Now we're going to go over to a young lady who has been doing her PhD on the letters of Mary Ann McCracken. So we're just going to hand you over to Catherine McWilliams. Okay.
Hello. Good evening, Belfast. This is Oslo calling. I'm based in Oslo. Firstly, I'd like to thank John for sending me a signed copy of his wonderful pamphlet in the post. Here I have it. All the way to Oslo, no less. So it's very much appreciated, and I think we can all agree that it looks fantastic with the cover image of Elizabeth O'Kane's terracotta bust on the front. It's very striking. And it's great to have all of John's work on Marianne compiled and made available in this expanded and updated form. I'm also really pleased that John has managed to get the pamphlet out this year, given that many of the other commemorations relating to the 250th anniversary of Marianne's birth have had to be postponed. And it's nice to have something to celebrate this year. So just to briefly introduce myself, as Stephen said, I'm a doctoral student. I'm researching and working on the letters and legacy of Ann McCracken. My thesis is now in the final stages, and COVID permitting, it will be completed in the new year, to be followed by a volume of Marianne's collected letters. There's about 181, I think, in total. So I first came across Marianne back in 2009 when I started working as a visitor guide at the Ulster Museum. It had just newly reopened. I came across Mary's, the photograph, the well-known photograph of Mary in her old age, and read the paragraph about her and was very, very intrigued to know who this amazing woman was. So I went away and I found an old copy of Mary McNeill's biography, and I was very curious to find out more. So I ordered the 1998 edited volume, which I have here, The Women of 1798, where I first encountered John's work. His chapter was one of the first academic pieces I read, and I was intrigued by John's compelling argument that an agnostic approach was needed towards the unrequited lover narrative, which is built up around Mary and Marianne and Thomas Russell. This also fueled my interest in taking a kind of a critical approach towards some of the folk history which had come to settle on Marianne's shoulders over the centuries. So when researching literary images of Marianne for my thesis, John very kindly sent me extracts from his 1988 play, Who Fears to Speak, in which Marianne features as a minor character. And he said, and I quote from the email, Marianne only plays a minor part because the piece is substantially based on documentary sources. This hard-headed preference for evidence over mythology really resonated with my own approach. So really, just to turn to the pamphlet then, in the pamphlet, John sheds new light on Marianne's numerous charitable causes, which he spoke about earlier. Yes, as she calls it in her letters, her out-of-door avocations. And in a biography of her step-grandaunt, Anna McCleary makes the assertion that Marianne was, quote, was one of an association to prevent the employment of climbing boys in chimney sweeping. So John further investigates this claim, pinpointing the establishment of a Belfast committee for superseding the use of chimney boys in the cleaning of chimneys at, quote, a well-attended public meeting in May 1834. So that research really gives credibility to McCleary's assertion. And even Mary McNeill was unable to find any real kind of solid evidence or documents to back that up. I was also particularly interested to see that John had unearthed a record from 1855, which documents Marianne manning a stall at a bazaar in aid of the Lancastrian school. And John's final reflections on Marianne as a memory keeper for the United Irishmen acts to remind us that the legitimate object of history is truth. It is Marianne's truth which John seeks to preserve within these pages, thus allowing her story to, as John concludes, lend strength to a new generation willing to fight for a better society, however daunting the task. Thank you, and many congratulations, John.
Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. That was great. Really, really great. Thank you. Right, John. Now we've got a couple of questions, if you don't mind answering them.
I'll do my best.
If Aaron, or any of the three can answer them. Okay. So the first one I have here is, what was Mary Ann's attitude to the Young Irelanders or the Fenian movement?
Nothing said about the Young Irelanders. I don't think, Catherine, you may have discovered stuff about the Young Irelanders.
I do. There is something about the Young Irelanders, but as I say, it's 180 letters, and I'll have to flick back and forth to see if I can find it. Bear with me, I'll have a look.
Really, the Fenians were after her time. I mean, she lived till 1866. But what is really interesting is that Roney, sorry, I've forgotten his, let me just check here. It's really interesting how her life and her experience helped inspire the Fenians. Where are we? Yes, Frank Roney, who was one of the leaders of the Fenians in Belfast, and was eventually imprisoned and allowed to get off if he emigrated to the United States, where he became a leading trade union leader in California. But he wrote his memoirs, and he describes how, as a child, his mother brought him to see Mary Ann McCracken on St. Patrick's Day. And I mean, he claims that the curtains in the house in Donegal Street were kept drawn all the year, except on St. Patrick's Day. And Mary Ann McCracken and another woman who Frank Roney thought was Mary Ann's sister, but it couldn't have been her sister because her sister had died in 1829. Don't know who the second woman was, but they were all dressed in green to celebrate St. Patrick's Day. And he says that memory was, in a way, a great inspiration to him in the course he then took in engaging in the Fenian movement.
Thank you, John. There's another one here that is a wee bit interesting as well. Okay, was O'Connell aware of her, and if so, did he have an opinion?
I don't know. Actually, what I should have done is check O'Connell's published correspondence. I mean, there's a voluminous multi-volume edition of O'Connell's correspondence. So, failure. Bad boy, you didn't check O'Connell's correspondence.
No problem. Well, Aaron, did you find anything about O'Connell? No?
I didn't. I haven't found anything on if O'Connell knew of or his opinion of Mary Ann, but I know that John mentioned that Mary Ann's opinion of him. But there's one thing that stands out for me is that she gives off about O'Connell's campaign for repeal the union, and says that he should have started with the tithe duty because it had a disproportionate impact on the labouring class. So I just think that gives us an insight into Mary Ann in terms of, for her, it was about social justice. It wasn't always a political aim. So unfortunately, I have nothing more really to add, but that always sticks with me, that comment about O'Connell.
Of course, the other thing is that, the great anti-slavery meetings in, 1845, to do with the visit, what's the name of the guy who's now going to have a statue?
Frederick Douglass.
Frederick Douglass. Well, very interesting. I mean, Frederick Douglass was a terrific public speaker and a great draw. But he did rock boats in Belfast because he made no bones about his admiration for Daniel O'Connell. And of course, Tories, or the sort of the unionist opinion, as it in the future would become, were vehemently opposed to anything that O'Connell was up to. And of course, O'Connell had a really honorable record on slavery. He was certainly going to send back any subscriptions to his cause that came from slave sources. And you see, the controversy was already going on within Presbyterianism in Belfast, that there was a wing of the Presbyterian Church that was accepting donations from rich Presbyterian congregations in the southern states, the slave states. And Frederick Douglass's position was that they should send the money back. And in fact, there was some opposition to his visit. And if you'll excuse my using the contemporary language of the placards went up in the town saying, so, racism was alive and well, or beginning to flourish in Belfast by the time you reach the late 1840s, albeit that Frederick Douglass's visit was an overwhelming success.
Thank you very much, John. That was very good of you. Really, I don't think there's anything left, really. Well, this is the wee book pamphlet here, and if you wanted, come over to the Facebook group or send the money to John's email. I attached it to the chat there at the very top. Thank you very much to Aaron and Catherine for coming on, and it's much appreciated all the way from Oslo. And nice, John. Thank you again.
We'll meet again.
Maybe
preferably with a pint in hand.
Yeah, I can do that. Well, thank you very much again, and thank you everybody for tuning in.
Thanks, Stephen.
No problem.